Hey there. Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be unpacking some really fascinating insights from Adam Grant's book, Give and Take. You shared that you're interested in understanding the different approaches to reciprocity. You know, how giving, taking, and mashing play out at work, in networking, and just in life overall.
You're right, those dynamics are constantly at play, and it's not always obvious which approach leads to the best outcomes. This deep dive will shed some light on that for you.
Exactly. We all want to be successful.
Hmm.
But is being a giver a path to success or just a recipe for being a doormat? That's something you specifically wanted to explore, right?
It's a question a lot of people grapple with, and Adam Grant really tackles this head on and give and take.
So to kick things off, let's talk about the three reciprocity styles Grant lays out: givers, takers, and matchers.
Think of it as a spectrum. On one end, you have the takers who are always trying to maximize their own gain, even at the expense of others. They're constantly looking for what they can get rather than what they can give.
And on the other end, you have the givers, those who prioritize helping others, often without expecting anything in return. They're driven by a genuine desire to contribute and make a positive impact.
Right. And in the middle, we have the matchers. They believe in fairness and reciprocity, aiming for a balance between giving and taking. They'll help you out, but they'll also expect something in return down the line.
Now, there's this common misconception that givers are pushovers, that they finish last. But Grant's book actually challenges that idea.
Yes, it's a really intriguing argument. He presents evidence suggesting that certain types of givers are actually the most successful.
Okay, so let's talk about some real-world examples. The book talks about Adam Rifkin, a guy who built an incredible network by consistently operating as a giver. He's helped tons of people launch companies and advance their careers, often without expecting anything in return.
Rifkin's story is a great example of how giving can create a powerful network effect. By consistently adding value to others' lives, he built a community of people who were eager to help him in return. He understood that giving is an investment in relationships.
It makes you wonder if all givers are this successful with this approach. The book also talks about venture capitalist David Hornick, who actually lost a deal because the entrepreneur he was considering funding perceived his generosity as a weakness.
That's right. The entrepreneur was worried that Hornick wouldn't be tough enough to push him to build a truly successful business. It highlights how the perception of giving can sometimes backfire.
So we have two givers, Rifkin, who thrives, and Hornick, who struggles. They both clearly prioritize helping others. What's the difference then?
Grant dives into the nuances of how and why people give, and that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so it sounds like there are different types of giving. Tell me more about that.
Exactly. Grant introduces this idea of otherish giving. It's not purely altruistic, but it's not purely selfish either. It's a blend of both.
So otherish givers are still driven by a desire to help others, but they also recognize the value of their own contributions. They're strategic about their giving.
Exactly. They find ways to help others that also align with their own goals and interests.
Do you have an example of this from the book? Someone who embodies this idea of other-ish giving.
Sure, think of John Huntsman Sr., the billionaire philanthropist. He's been incredibly successful in business, but he also attributes a large part of his wealth to a lifetime of giving. He's always looking for opportunities to make a difference, especially in the fight against cancer. But he also structures his giving in a way that benefits his businesses.
So otherish giving isn't just about warm, fuzzy feelings. There's a strategic element to it that can actually fuel personal and collective success.
Right. It's about creating win-win situations where everyone benefits, and there's research to back this up. Economist Arthur Brooks, for instance, has found a strong link between giving and increased income.
That's wild. I mean, you wouldn't automatically think that giving away money or time would lead to earning more money.
It seems counterintuitive, but it tracks with the idea that giving can actually make us more productive and energized.
So it's not just about being altruistic. There's a strategic element to other-ish giving that benefits both the giver and the receiver.
Exactly, and this brings up a fascinating question. Is there even such a thing as pure altruism? Or are all acts of giving ultimately motivated, even in a small way, by self-interest?
That's getting into some deep philosophical territory. Does Grant touch on that?
He does. He highlights this debate between two psychologists, C. Daniel Batson and Robert Cialdini.
Okay, what are their positions?
Batson believes in empathy-driven altruism. He argues that we can act selflessly when we connect with another person's suffering and are purely motivated by a desire to help.
So basically, we can put ourselves in another person's shoes and act solely out of compassion.
Yeah, that's Batson's view. But Cialdini offers a different perspective. He suggests that all giving, no matter how selfless it seems, ultimately serves some degree of self-interest. Maybe we feel good about helping, or it boosts our reputation, or perhaps it even eases our own distress by alleviating someone else's suffering.
So is it nature or nurture? Are we inherently altruistic or just wired to prioritize our own well-being?
It's a tough question. Grant doesn't give a definitive answer, but he does offer a thought-provoking example. He talks about Duran Beale, the guy who founded FreeCycle. Initially, Beale just wanted to get rid of unwanted stuff. A pretty self-serving motivation, right?
Sounds like a classic case of being a taker or maybe a matcher at best.
You'd think so, but here's the twist. As Beale started giving things away, he felt this unexpected emotional reward. Seeing the gratitude of people who received the items and realizing the impact he was making shifted his perspective.
So even though he began with a self-serving intention, the act of giving itself sparked a change in his motivation.
Exactly, and this suggests that most giving likely involves a mix of motive. Pure altruism, while a beautiful ideal, may be less common than we think.
Makes you think for sure. Maybe the initial motive isn't that important as long as the act of giving has positive outcomes for both people involved.
That's an interesting point, and it leads to another crucial question. How do givers avoid getting taken advantage of? How do they prevent becoming doormats?
Yeah, if giving can be so easily exploited, how can givers protect themselves?
Grant gets into the nitty-gritty of this. He presents concrete strategies givers can use in a world full of takers and matchers. He even shares a story about a consultant named Lillian Bauer, whose generosity actually ended up stalling her career.
Wait, what happened? I thought givers were supposed to be successful.
Well, in Bauer's case, she went overboard with her giving. She was always mentoring colleagues, taking on extra work, bending over backward for clients.
On the surface, that sounds like she was a dream employee.
She was in a lot of ways, but her giving became excessive. She never said no, so people started seeing her as a pushover.
Ouch. So her generosity backfired.
Exactly. Her colleagues began to exploit her willingness to help, and she ended up overloaded and overwhelmed. Her own work started to suffer.
A classic example of the doormat effect. So how do you avoid that trap? How can givers be generous without being taken advantage of?
Grant talks about sincerity screening as a crucial skill for givers. It's all about learning to differentiate between genuine requests for help and those that are just disguised attempts to take advantage of your kindness.
Okay, I like the name, but how do you actually do that? How can you tell if someone is sincere or just trying to use you?
It takes practice. You need to pay close attention to people's motives and their patterns of behavior. Do they constantly ask for favors without ever reciprocating? Do their actions match their words?
Sounds like you need to be a bit of a detective.
In a way, yeah. Grant shares a story about a financial advisor named Peter Audit who learned to spot takers pretty quickly. One of his clients, Brad, seemed charming at first, eager to learn from Audit, but his actions told a different story.
What did Brad do? Give us the dirt.
Brad was constantly hitting Audit up for advice and favors, but he never returned the favor. He even went as far as poaching one of Audit's top clients.
Wow, that's low. What a betrayal of trust.
Exactly. Audit realized he had been too trusting and learned to be more discerning about who he helped. He started to apply sincerity screening.
Sincerity screening sounds like a key strategy for givers. It's a way to protect yourself and make sure your energy is going towards the right people.
Absolutely. And it's not just about weeding out takers. It's also about recognizing and supporting the genuine givers.
Right. You want to build relationships that are mutually beneficial, where there's a healthy balance of give and take.
Exactly. And there are other strategies, too. The book talks about another consultant, Jason Geller, who gained a reputation for being incredibly helpful at Deloitte. He even created a knowledge-sharing network he called the JNet, which gave colleagues easy access to information and resources.
Sounds like he was the go-to guy for information.
He was, but Geller didn't just blindly give to everyone. He used sincerity screening to figure out who reciprocated and who just took without giving back.
So he was strategic with his giving, even while building this massive network.
Exactly. He didn't let takers drain his time and energy. He focused on supporting people who showed a genuine willingness to contribute.
So sincerity screening is like the first line of defense for givers. What else can givers do to make sure they're not being exploited?
Another important strategy Grant emphasizes is perspective taking.
Perspective taking. Isn't that something we should all be doing anyway?
You're absolutely right, but it's especially important for givers who can sometimes get so caught up in helping others that they forget their own needs, or they have a hard time seeing things from another person's point of view.
So how does perspective taking play out in practical terms?
It allows givers to understand the motivations and interests of the other person, even when those motivations might be very different from their own.
So it's about putting yourself in their shoes, trying to see the world from their perspective.
Precisely, and this can be incredibly helpful in negotiations where givers can sometimes be at a disadvantage.
Why are givers at a disadvantage in negotiations? What makes them vulnerable?
They tend to be agreeable and accommodating. They want to make people happy and find solutions that work for everyone. And that's great, but it can lead to making too many concessions and not effectively advocating for their own needs.
Ah, so they might end up getting walked all over in a negotiation.
That's the risk, but perspective taking can help them avoid this.
How so? Give me an example of this in action.
Sure, Grant shares a story about Peter Audit, again, remember the financial advisor, and how he used perspective taking to negotiate with a very demanding client named Rich. Rich was pushing Audit hard to reduce his fees, putting Audit in a tough spot.
Sounds like a classic power struggle.
It did, but instead of giving in or getting defensive, Audit took a step back and tried to understand Rich's perspective.
What did he learn? What was going on with Rich?
It turned out that Rich wasn't just being greedy, he was actually really insecure about looking weak or foolish in front of his colleagues. It was an ego thing.
Ah, so it wasn't just about the money.
Exactly. Armed with this insight, Audit was able to craft a solution that addressed Rich's need for validation.
What did he do? How did he turn things around?
He agreed to slightly reduce his fees, but presented it as a special favor to Rich, emphasizing Rich's savvy negotiating skills to his colleagues.
So he made Rich feel like a winner while still protecting his own interests.
Precisely perspective taking helped Audit turn a potentially combative negotiation into a collaborative one.
That's brilliant. It shows how understanding someone's deeper motivations can unlock creative solutions.
It's a powerful tool, and it leads us to the third strategy. Grant highlights assertive advocacy.
Assertive advocacy.
Okay.
That sounds a little contradictory. Aren't givers supposed to be selfless and accommodating?
It's a common misconception. Assertiveness doesn't have to mean being aggressive or bossy. It's about confidently and respectfully advocating for your own needs and for the needs of others.
So it's about having a voice at the table and making sure you're heard.
Right, and while givers are often great at advocating for other people, they can sometimes struggle to advocate for themselves.
Why is that?
They're so focused on helping others that they may downplay their own contributions and hesitate to ask for what they deserve, which again can lead to getting taken advantage of.
Right. So how does assertive advocacy help with that?
It allows givers to represent their own interests effectively while still maintaining their generosity.
Do you have an example of assertive advocacy from the book? Someone who really nailed it.
Grant talks about a guy named Samir who was being treated unfairly by his company. His boss wanted him to relocate, which would have created a ton of problems for Samir's family.
Sounds like a no-win situation.
It seemed that way. Samir's first instinct was just to do what his boss said, putting his family's needs second. Classic giver move.
Right, the selfless giver instinct.
Yeah.
But he didn't give in.
He realized that he had to stand up for himself and his family. So he had a very honest conversation with his boss, explaining the situation and asking for a more flexible arrangement.
I'm guessing the boss wasn't thrilled about this.
Actually, the boss respected Samir's assertiveness. He saw that Samir was willing to advocate for what he believed in, that he wasn't afraid to have a difficult conversation. It built trust.
Wow, that's surprising. You might think a boss would see that as a challenge to their authority.
You might think so, but in Samir's case, it actually strengthened his relationship with his boss.
That's a great reminder that assertiveness can be a real strength even for givers.
It's essential. It's about knowing your worth and being willing to speak up for yourself.
So we've got sincerity screening perspective taking and assertive advocacy as the three key strategies for givers to avoid being taken advantage of.
They're essential tools for anyone who wants to be a giver and thrive in a world where not everyone operates with the same level of generosity.
These strategies help givers strike that balance, allowing them to protect themselves, make sure their contributions are valued, and ultimately have a bigger impact.
Exactly, and it makes you wonder what happens when you move beyond the individual level. Can you shift an entire culture toward giving?
That's a great question. That's something Grant covers in the book. He talks about this fascinating idea called the Scrooge shift.
It's the idea that group norms can influence even the most hardcore takers to be more generous. Think of it like peer pressure, but in a good way.
Okay, I'm picturing Ebenezer Scrooge suddenly turning into Santa Claus. How does that work?
Imagine you're part of a group where everyone is helpful and generous. You're more likely to follow suit, even if you're naturally inclined to be a taker. It's about setting the expectation that giving is the norm, not the exception.
So how do you create that kind of environment? Where do you even begin?
Grant uses the example of FreeCycle. Remember, we talked about that earlier. It's a platform where people give away stuff for free. And research actually shows that it really does promote giving, even among people who aren't typically all that generous.
That's so interesting. Why would someone who's usually a taker participate in a system where they aren't guaranteed anything in return? What's in it for them?
It goes back to the power of social norms. When everyone around you is giving, it just becomes the expected behavior. Plus, there's also an element of public accountability built into the system. Your actions are visible to the whole community, so even the most Scrooge-like people might feel compelled to contribute. Nobody wants to look stingy.
So FreeCycle creates a culture of giving by making it normal public, and even by subtly appealing to the self-interest of those who might lean toward taking. I like that. What can leaders and organizations learn from this? How can they apply these principles in a work setting?
It's about creating a similar environment, right? Make it clear that helping others is not only valued, but expected. Celebrate those acts of generosity. Make sure you're recognizing givers for their contributions, not just the takers who might be grabbing for the spotlight.
Make giving part of the company culture okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Uh-huh.
But we've talked a lot about the individual benefits of giving, and now the organizational benefits. What about the ripple effect? How does this idea of giving play out in the bigger picture?
Grant tells a great story about George Meyer, one of the writers on The Simpsons. He was known for his talent, of course, but also for his willingness to do whatever needed to be done, even tasks that other writers might have considered beneath them.
So he was a giver behind the scenes, quietly contributing to the show's success.
Exactly. He'd spend hours polishing other people's work, making sure every episode was as funny and sharp as possible.
He sounds like an incredible team player.
He was, and his generosity had a ripple effect. It not only improved the quality of the show, but it also inspired others to contribute their best work.
It created this upward spiral of creativity and excellence.
Exactly. And in doing so, Meyer didn't just help the show succeed, he also enhanced his own career and reputation.
It's a great example of how giving isn't just about personal gain, it's also about contributing to something larger than yourself, making a positive impact on the world.
It reinforces that key idea. When you focus on expanding the pie for everyone, you often end up with a bigger slice yourself. Giving can create more abundance all around.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. What are the big takeaways you want our listener to walk away with?
First and foremost, giving when done strategically is not a weakness. It's a pathway to success and influence.
But it's not just any type of giving that leads to those outcomes, right?
Exactly. Remember the concept of other-ish giving. It's about finding that sweet spot where your generosity benefits both you and others.
Right. And don't forget those strategies: sincerity screening, perspective taking, and assertive advocacy.
Those are your essential tools for navigating a world where not everyone shares your giving spirit.
And finally, remember that you can foster a culture of giving in your own life and in your workplace.
Even seemingly small acts of generosity can have a ripple effect. You can inspire others and create a more positive, productive environment for everyone.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. What's the one thing you want our listener to do after listening to this deep dive?
Think about your own reciprocity style. Are you a giver, a taker, or a matcher? And how can you use what we've talked about today to be a more strategic and impactful giver?
It's a great question to reflect on. And if you want to explore these ideas further, definitely check out Adam Grant's book, Give and Take. It's full of fascinating research and real-world stories that will completely change how you think about success.
It's a must-read for anyone who wants to make a positive impact on the world while also achieving their own goals.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.